Eric Olson is Associate Director of the Wilson Center's Latin American Program and also Senior Advisor to the Mexico Institute. He joins us in that capacity today to talk about this series of articles the Mexico Institute has been creating, charting a new course. Eric writes about U.S. Mexico security cooperation. Welcome, Eric. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Shared responsibility for security defined by the Merida Initiative. Could you talk about its origins? Talk about the history of it.
Sure, of course. Shared responsibility is just the concept that both the United States and Mexico work together together on addressing security problems in both countries. I think we went from a period before 2007 where there was a lot of finger pointing, blaming Mexico for the problems of drugs and organized crime, and Mexico blaming the United States for its consumption of drugs that was driving this network of illegal trafficking. And so that was kind of the tradition or the way things operated up to 2007, when President George W. Bush and President Felipe Calderon got together in the city of Merida and announced a new framework for security cooperation, which has been known as shared responsibility, where both sides agree they have a common problem, they will work on it together, and obviously each one has individual aspects that they need to address as well. But it was putting it in this common framework. And I think that's a subtle change, but a major change, because the two countries were no longer at odds. The finger pointing was not the basis of the relationship.
With geography as destiny, people tend to look at the world from their perspective, and that makes sense. But what about from the Mexican perspective on this cross-border problems? Guns from the U.S. coming into Mexico, for example. What is the perspective from Mexico?
Sure. There's three things that Mexico usually raises related to this issue of security. One is firearms. Firearms are purchased in the United States and trafficked into Mexico, and they become a major, not source of violence, but make violence worse. High-powered weapons that make their way into the hands of criminal organizations, and a lot of violence comes from that. The other thing is laundering of money. The drugs come to the U.S., people purchase it, and so there's a lot of money that results from that, and some of it is trafficked back into Mexico, and it affects their financial system as well, and it becomes a source of corruption. And the third is, of course, consumption of drugs in the United States. A lot of this has to do with demand in the United States.
So you say this dates back to the Calderon-Bush era.
Right.
And is it still viable, or have the threats evolved in ways where we need to take a look at the agreement and do some things differently?
Well, I think there are always new threats and new aspects of the security challenges that both countries face, but the principle of working on those things together, collaboratively, I think is still very valid. It's extraordinarily hard for the U.S. to deal with, for instance, the growing problem of heroin production and trafficking and consumption in the United States, if Mexico is not helping. If Mexico is seen as somehow the enemy, then it makes it extraordinarily difficult for the U.S. to have an effective plan and strategy in Mexico. It's not a viable solution to say we'll solve all these problems at the U.S.-Mexican border. Obviously, there's border enforcement that needs to take place, but it can't all be dealt with at the border. It has to be dealt with in Mexico, in Central America, in the trafficking routes, and you need collaboration from your counterparts, Mexico and Central America, to address these problems.
Beyond the bluster of the campaign season and the early days of the Trump administration, what is happening behind the scenes as far as this level of cooperation? I think as we sit here, the day we're recording this interview, John Kelly and Rex Tillerson are traveling to Mexico. What do we know about the actual level of cooperation as it relates to security issues?
Well, so far, despite a lot of publicity and bluster, the relationship is still intact. It could be at risk, it could change, it could break down, but the relationship is still intact. And I think the visit of Secretary Mattis and Secretary Kelly to Mexico right now is at a critical juncture. They need to communicate to Mexico that, yes, the U.S. wants to do more on its border to protect itself, but that doesn't preclude the possibility of continuing to cooperate with Mexico. And I think that is vitally important, and I am confident that Secretary Kelly and Mattis understand that. Because that's at the very core of the relationship.
So talk to us, Eric, about some of the recommendations you make in this piece.
Well, principally, of course, it is to preserve the framework of shared responsibility. I think it's been successful in the last 10 years since it was announced by the presidents in 2007. We need to preserve that. And maybe that's, obvious, but I think, again, in the midst of a lot of rhetoric and pronouncements, there's been some questioning, and Mexico has felt offended by that, by some of what has been said. So we need to preserve that and continue on. In addition to that, it's very important that the United States not understand the security threats from Mexico and in Mexico is limited to drug trafficking. Actually, there's a diversity of issues that have to be addressed. Drug trafficking being one, human trafficking is another. Weak state institutions, police, prosecutors, judges, those folks have to be strengthened and capable of fighting and taking on these issues on their own. And one of the central areas where the U.S. has helped is in supported the reform of Mexico's criminal justice system. And that's vitally important to continue that.
Eric, thanks for joining us. I just want to tell our viewers that if you'd like to read Eric's full report, you can find it at wilsoncenter.org. Under the research tab, you'll find the Mexico Institute. This and all the other resources will be available to you. Eric, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you.